Okay, good evening, everybody. Kia ora, welcome to the Otago Museum. My name's Ian Griffin, and I'm the director of the museum, and I'm very, very excited this evening to be able to introduce a very, very special guest who has come all the way from Houston to speak to us this evening. The museum is very keen to support science engagement, and we want to try and inspire people to take an interest in science. So whenever we get a chance to bring an astronaut to Dunedin, we jump up and say yes. Before introducing our main speaker this evening, I should say that if there is any emergency during the course of this evening, please make your way to the door at the back and assemble outside the museum in the museum reserve. Colonel Michael Hopkins has flown in space for 166 days. And this evening, we're very excited to hear his story. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Colonel Michael Hopkins.
Okay, good evening, Dunedin. It is absolutely fantastic to, It's absolutely fantastic to be here. Good evening to all of those that are up in the other room as well. Tonight's theme is the day in the life of an astronaut. And the fact of the matter is there are over 50 active astronauts at NASA, and so my story is just one of many. And in fact, when I look up at this poster of all of the astronauts that we have, quite frankly, my story is not nearly as interesting as most of the ones up there. So I want you to kind of keep that in mind as we go through tonight, is that this is just one story of many. And so you know, I'll share mine, but there's a lot of amazing people that are involved in the space program, the human spaceflight program. So without further ado, though, what's my background? I grew up on a farm in Missouri, so that is me right there. That's on my dad and my brother, and we had hogs and cattle. At one point I was thinking maybe I would become a rodeo cowboy, but you can see I'm not doing a very good job of it. So another point, I wanted to be a football player. I did have a chance to play up at university, but I wasn't destined for the NFL, so I had to have a bit of another plan. And so that plan involved going into the Air Force. And so I actually, when I went off to the University of Illinois to study aerospace engineering, I also joined the Air Force ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps. So I am actually not only an astronaut, but I am also a colonel in the United States Air Force. I've been in the Air Force now for about 25 years or so. About the time in high school when I started thinking about becoming an officer in the Air Force and getting into aviation, I also became interested in the space program. And that was back in the early days of the space shuttle. And so in school, in high school, they used to actually show the launches during school, and that kind of really just piqued my interest in it. And so that's really what drove me to thinking that was something I wanted to do. And then I've also, you see some pictures here. There's my wife. I met her at the University of Illinois as well. We have two sons that are quite a bit older than this now. They're actually 19 and 16. And in fact, the oldest one is at university. 2009, I was selected as part of the 20th astronaut class. This was after 4 tries over 13 years. So it was a bit of a lengthy process. I was kind of stubborn and had decided that I was going to continue applying to NASA until they either accepted me or told me just to stop applying because we're really not that interested. So I do have 3 rejection letters. So for the younger crowd here, I certainly encourage you, if there's something that you're interested in doing, pursue that and don't give up if you should run into a few roadblocks along the way. Our class back in 2009 was actually made up of 2 Canadian astronauts, Jeremy and David, and then 3 Japanese astronauts, and then 9 U.S. astronauts. to include 3 female astronauts and 5 military astronauts. So we had 2 Navy, 2 Air Force, and 1 Army that was involved in the space program. So immediately after showing up, this was back in 2009, the space shuttle was slated to be retired in 2011. So we were coming into NASA, into the human spaceflight program in a period of transition. So they didn't even bother training us in the space shuttle because they knew we would never finish our basic astronaut training, which usually takes about 2 years. We wouldn't finish that in time to ever have a chance to fly on the space shuttle, unfortunately. So what we were prepared for was going up on the International Space Station. And the International Space Station was built and is operated by 15 nations. So the US, Russia, Japan, Canada, and 12 European countries. I think I probably did that math wrong, but so this is the International Space Station. The first module, which is right there, that module is a Russian component, and it went up in 1998. We first started manning the space station around 2000, and so since 2000, we have had people on board the International Space Station. So there has been at least 2 people orbiting the Earth now for 17 plus years. So that's kind of, a lot of people don't realize that. In fact, a lot of people think when we retired the space shuttle that we stopped going up into space, and that's far from the fact. We've continually been exploring space for many years now. The International Space Station itself is made up of all of these different modules. In this center section here that I'm highlighting, that's the pressurized portion of the space station. So that's where we live and work as astronauts. The volume is about the size of the interior of a 747, or maybe a 4 or 5 bedroom, 6 bedroom house, just to give you a sense. But it's a little bit different because it's all of these individual modules that have been connected together. And those individual modules, they came up on the space, a lot of them came up on the space shuttle. And so without the space shuttle, we wouldn't have the International Space Station right now. A couple other things to point out on the space station. We do operate it in 2 different segments. So this segment up here we call the US segment, and then down on this portion is the Russian segment. And that's simply the majority of the work by the Russian cosmonauts that are on board is done down here, and the majority of the work by the US astronauts that are on board is on our portion of the segment. Now, there is not a border right here. We don't have to clear customs to go down and work on the Russian segment and vice versa. We are one crew when we're on board. We are now, the crew is made up of 6 people, so typically it's 2 to 3 US astronauts, 2 to 3 Russian cosmonauts, and then 1 astronaut from either Japan, Canada, or Europe. The way we get up and down is in groups of 3. So when I first showed up to the International Space Station in 2013, there were 3 people on board. They had been there for about 3 months. We joined them, and then 3 months later they came home. And 3 new people came up and joined us. And then at the end of another 3 months, we came home. So right now, on board the International Space Station, we do missions of about 6 months long. And we kind of leapfrog crews as we come up and down. A couple other things to point out on the station before we move along. This section, all the way across this way, that's unpressurized. So that's where our solar arrays are, so that's where we get our power. And then these big things here on each side, those are actually radiators. We generate a lot of heat on board the International Space Station. I'm sorry if I'm blocking your guys' view over here. We generate a lot of heat on board on the space station. So we have over 50 computers on board. We've got life support equipment. We've got all the science that's on board, and all of that equipment generates heat. And so we actually have to get rid of that heat with these radiators, this external cooling system. So how do we get to the International Space Station since we retired the shuttle? We actually get there on a Russian vehicle. And so since 2011, our only access to space has been with the Russian Soyuz. And so this is the actual rocket itself. The capsule on launch is actually right up here. And so that's where you're located when you launch to the International Space Station. This vehicle, they've been launching since the Apollo days. So If you remember Apollo-Soyuz, right? So this is the vehicle that they've been launching. One of the things that the Russians do very well is when they have something that works, they just keep using it. And so they've been doing it for a lot of years, and this is a very reliable vehicle for us. So what's sitting right up here on this rocket when it launches is this space vehicle right here. So this is the Soyuz. It's made up of 3 different components. Where the astronauts are located is this middle section. And so what, if you were to look inside, this is what you would see inside, is 3 astronauts stuffed inside that capsule. So there's not a lot of room. It's not very comfortable, but it is a reliable way to get to space and get to the International Space Station. So again, that's how we get there now. And so when I talked about we go up and down in 3s, this is how we're doing it. We're doing it on this Soyuz vehicle. So when you ride up on this Soyuz and dock to the space station, this capsule stays docked for the entire time you're there, for that 6 months. And so the other crew also has their Soyuz up there as well. And so that vehicle is there so that if at any point during your stay on board there's an emergency, such as a fire or a leak, where you're depressurizing in the station, or you have ammonia get in the station, you can take that vehicle and get home safe. Hopefully nothing goes wrong during your mission, and if that's the case, then you actually ride that vehicle home at the end of your 166 days in my case. Now I'm going to give you a little bit of an inside look at how you prepare to launch on this vehicle. So you notice here, you see these suits that I'm wearing, the white suits? So those are the Sokol suits, and that's the pressurization suit that we wear during ascent and entry. And what the reason we have that is so that if anything goes wrong while you're launching, that's going to keep you alive. All right, so let's say your vehicle starts to depressurize, you have a leak in the vehicle. This is going to stay pressurized, so it's a pressure suit, and it stays at a high enough pressure that allows you to get enough oxygen, which allows you to stay alive and still be able to operate the vehicle and get yourself home. And so a very important piece of equipment when we're launching and landing, going into space. Each individual with the Sokol, this is my suit. It was sized for me individually. And then the other interesting part is when you looked inside that capsule, you're actually in a seat pan that has been molded to you as well. And the reason for that is because when you take off and you land, you don't want to be able to move around in that seat because you're going to be under some high G loads and things of that nature, and so you want to ensure that you're very secure when you're doing that. But you're probably wondering, how do they mold your body and make this seat pan? So let's take a look. Let's take a look at that. So what they actually end up doing is they pour a mold around you. So here they are pouring this plaster around me and holding me down so that I don't move and mess up the mold. And then I'm going to sit there with them holding me down for a certain amount of time while we let that plaster dry a little bit. And then the next question is, well, how do you get out without messing up the mold? Well, the way you get out is a lower crane. You grab onto that, and at the right time, they pull you out. And so this is the same process that they've been doing since the 60s, right? And this is how they've built every Soyuz and prepared each of the crews for going into space. So quite an outfit there, you know. But anyway, it's kind of neat when the first time you go for a fit check and it's your suit. You know, they have practice suits that we use initially for training and things of that nature, but when you go down and get to try on the suit that has your name on it for the first time, that's a pretty special day. So let's actually look at a launch itself. Oh no, I'm sorry, I forgot something, excuse me. Some of the other training. This is a centrifuge. And so we're actually practicing the G loads that we experience during ascent and entry. So there you can see me under the G loads, and I think at this point we'll see on the screen, yeah, we're up at about 6 Gs or so. My heartbeat is around 70, so they're tracking all this, but we're simulating the loads that you're going to experience. And if everybody understands, so right now we're at 1 G, and when we launch with the acceleration, we experience more Gs. We experience up to 3.5 Gs when we launch, and then when you're landing, you can experience up to 5. If you go ballistic, you can even get up to 6, 7, 8 Gs, 9 Gs. And so that's kind of all pushing down on your chest with the way we're seated in the vehicle. And so we get to practice that before we launch. And so that's a bit of an interesting experience as well, because it is very difficult to breathe when you've got all of this extra weight that's kind of pressing down on your chest. And then you still have to be able to function. You still have to be able to operate the spacecraft in these kind of situations as well. Now I think we're ready, for the launch itself. So this is over in Star City outside of Moscow, and we're getting ready to go through our final exam. So we're going to jump in a simulator, and in that simulator we're going to spend about 6 hours going through emergencies as we launch and dock and undock and return to Earth. That's getting us ready for here. We go down to Baikonur in Kazakhstan. This is the vehicle that I launched on. And there we are about 2.5 hours prior to launch. We're crawling up and riding the elevator up to the top of the vehicle and getting on board. They strap you in. It's as I mentioned, as you can see from the earlier picture, it is pretty crowded. You actually have your knees are kind of all the way up in your chest, and you're strapped down, and so it can be a little bit uncomfortable as you're sitting there for 2 hours waiting for this to happen. And this is a pretty special moment when you hear that countdown and you feel the rocket light and you're on your way.
Is now on its way with Mike Hopkins, Oleg Kotov, and Sergei Ryazanskiy on a 6-hour ride to the International Space Station.
And now you're traveling 17,500 miles an hour, 26,000 kilometers, something like that an hour, is how fast we're going. That's the actual vehicle. 6 hours later, we're actually docking to the International Space Station. So it took me about 15 hours to get here from Houston, and it only took me 6 hours to get from Kazakhstan to the International Space Station. Right after you get on board, one of the first things we get to do is have a video conference with our family. So that's my wife, my 2 sons. You can see how excited Lucas is. Dad's in space.
The launch is incredible. We are so proud of you. We love you so much.
Now, in his defense, they've been up for about 24 hours at this point, because they're actually in Baikonur as well, and it's a pretty long day. But again, this is the 3 in the back. Those are remember how I told you the crews that are already there? That was the 3 that were there when we showed up. And you can see here some of the advantages of the microgravity environment. You can put together some unique poses that are a little harder to do down here on Earth. And so I will say this: you're gonna hear throughout my talk a little bit of a theme where I'll keep bringing up the family, and the family is very important. And NASA and our partner nations, we treat the family with a lot of respect, and we understand all of the stresses that they're going through when you launch into space. So it is not a simple matter to sit there and watch your loved one crawl on top of 600,000 pounds of rocket fuel that's getting ready to explode. And so when we have a launch and a landing, we always have an astronaut escort that's with the family members. They're there to explain what's going on, to provide them a little bit of comfort, so that if they have questions, someone that's knowledgeable in what their loved one is going through, they can help explain that. And then, quite frankly, the other reason they're there is that if something does go wrong, they're able to provide that initial comfort and things of that nature in those bad situations. So I can't say enough. My wife was there, and my kids were there. My mom was there. She was probably worse than my wife, freaking out. But it is neat that they're able to share in the experience, too, of launching into space. Now, why do we go to the International Space Station? We go for science, the microgravity environment. The International Space Station is an orbiting laboratory. Now, this is not science. But what this does is demonstrate why we're doing science in this microgravity environment. Things behave differently up there. And so you can see how the water is behaving so much differently up there. All of a sudden, the surface tension of that water becomes a much more dominant force, and it just creates this bubble. And so now these guys are just having some fun on the weekend, but you get to see what it looks like from the inside of a water bubble in space. Now, I mentioned the tension, the surface tension, how it becomes a much more dominant force. So as this rolls along, watch as Swanee touches it, and you can see the water just starts to kind of walk up his finger. And so you can actually move fluids around up there just through this surface tension. And so if you want to, say, separate water and a fluid and a gas, you can actually do it without having to have a pump or anything running. It'll actually do it naturally through these surface tensions. And so that is why we do the science up there, is because of this microgravity environment, because we want to continue exploring the solar system. And in order to do that, we need to understand not only how the material and the equipment is going to behave in this environment, but we also need to understand how the human body is going to behave in this environment, right? Because, our body is made up of a lot of water, and you just saw how that water is behaving. And so there are changes that happen in the human body as well, and we want to understand that. And so now to actually show you some of the science that's going on as the astronauts, we are actually guinea pigs in a lot of different things. Here I'm actually taking an ultrasound of my eye. And we also do a lot of physical science type experiments. And so the one coming up next, this is an experiment we call spheres. And so it's two little satellites that we can control inside the space station. And I'm actually talking to the scientist, the principal investigator on the ground as we're executing it. So I become his eyes, I become his hands, his ears, while we execute the experiment. Now, another way the astronauts interface with the experiments is in this case. This is actually a combustion chamber. And I've pulled that combustion chamber out of a rack, and now I'm replacing the fuel reservoirs, the igniters, things of that nature, and I'm going to put it back in. And before I do, keep an eye out for Koichi Wakata, one of my crewmates. He's going to, there's Koichi. Now, there is a certain advantage of being in space, and there is no up or down. And so it is always kind of funny to watch your crewmates go by in a completely different orientation than what you are in, but you actually get used to that, believe it or not. But what's interesting about the way this science is done is I've put that chamber back in the rack, closed it up, and then while we're sleeping at night, someone on the ground will actually execute the experiment. And so that's a very powerful way for us to do science, because you don't have to have an astronaut necessarily hands-on the whole time that you're doing these experiments. In fact, for a lot of the experiments, we're not hands-on. We'll actually just set it up, and then it either happens automatically or someone on the ground is actually controlling it. And what that means then is during that 166 days that I was on orbit, we executed over 200 different experiments. And so it's incredible the amount of science that is happening on board the International Space Station. That science has two main goals. The first goal is to help further space exploration, human exploration of the solar system. The second goal is to better life down here on Earth. And so sometimes those experiments overlap, sometimes they don't. So for example, one of the experiments I worked on while I was on board was through diet, we were trying to control bone loss. And so I had a particular diet for a couple of weeks that was controlling my ratio of animal proteins to potassium. Because when we're on board the International Space Station, we can actually lose up to 2 to 2.5% bone density in a month. And so now you think about a 6-month mission, that would be a fairly significant loss in bone density. And so we have different ways we're trying to counter that, and this diet was one of those ways. So at the end of having this particular diet, I would then collect my blood, I would collect urine, we would freeze those samples, and then eventually they come down to the ground, and a scientist on the ground is then going to analyze that and figure out if this is a way that we can control bone loss. And so that's very important for us as we want to send astronauts out into the solar system, because they're going to be gone a long time. And we can't have them losing a bunch of bone density as they're doing that. Well, that also benefits all of us down here on Earth, right? Because as we get older, we're experiencing some of the same things. And it just happens a little bit slower down here on Earth. That's why space sometimes becomes a great laboratory, is because sometimes these effects happen very quickly. not just on humans, but we can also do science on animals on board as well. And so it's a great laboratory for us to help the conditions down here on Earth as well. How do we get things up into space? So when we launched in that Soyuz, there wasn't, you could probably tell, there wasn't a lot of extra room inside of it, right? So a lot of our supplies, the food, the science, the clothes that we all wear, will come up on these uncrewed, unmanned supply vehicles. And this is one example that came up on board while I was there. This is the Orbital ATK Cygnus vehicle. So there's the launch, and what happens is that vehicle is going to fly basically in formation with the space station. And it's going to come up below the station. You can see that here. And we're going to reach out with that robotic arm, and we're going to grab onto it. And so you can see here the inside, we're getting ready. So right over here is a hand controllers for that robotic arm. And so I'm going to sit there and control that robotic arm and drive it in and capture the vehicle. And so that's what's happening right now, is I'm driving the arm, we're going to grab onto it, and that's a good day when you grab onto it. You don't want to mess that one up, because you're going to go hungry if your crewmates are going to be pretty upset with you. Then what happens is we actually berth it to the station, and then you have to get the hatch open. A couple things here I want you to point out. We had some issues with the hatch, but I also want you to notice Koichi's feet. When you're floating around on station, your feet we use a lot more than what you're used to down here. They kind of, you lock them into these handrails, and watch Koichi as he's just moving around. He goes from one side to the other, and it becomes very natural to you. You can see how he's just sliding, locking his feet in, and now as you're floating, it allows you to be stable as you're moving around. And so that's one of the interesting that happens. One of the other things that's great, you also typically, when you have a supply vehicle come up, you get a bonus container from your family. And so it's special things, you know, food that you might like that's not normally sent up. And so in this case, we actually got some fresh tortillas. Rick got some pepper relish. He's from Connecticut, and there's this pepper relish, a little hot dog stand close to where he grew up, and that's what that is right there. And so his wife sent some up, and so you can see this is just literally a couple hours, not even a couple hours after getting that hatch open. And
it's not on a hot dog, but it's still darn good.
so you're usually pretty excited when a supply vehicle comes up because there is some very special things that usually come up with it. At the end of the mission, we take all of the supplies off. In this particular vehicle, it actually burns up when it enters the atmosphere. Okay, so it doesn't have a heat shield that protects you when you come back to land. And other vehicles, we have another vehicle that comes up that's built by SpaceX that actually does have a heat shield to it, and that's what, remember I talked about the blood and the urine samples? That one will actually come back and land. Now, both of those are just as important, right? Sometimes we think about the one that's coming back and landing as more important because that allows us to bring things back from space. But this vehicle is just as important as well, and you're going to see that as we go into the next slide. Let's see if we get there. Yeah, so this is the vehicle, and all of that stuff you see is trash. So we have completely stuffed this vehicle with trash, and in fact, down on the end of it, there's actually a little bit of space. And let's see if I'm actually crawling in there to fill up every last bit of space we can with trash. So where does that trash come from? So experiments that we no longer need on board, we throw those out. Our clothes, we don't have a washer and dryer on board. So you wear your clothes for a couple weeks, and when they start to stand up by themselves, you throw them out. All of our food is individually wrapped little portions. You'll see a little bit of that in a second. And so all of that has to go out in the trash. Human waste, right? Our solid human waste also ends up in a can, and that ends up in a trash. And so it's a great day when you get a vehicle like this up there and you can start to offload the trash, because for a month and a half or 2 months, you've been stuffing that down in one of the modules, and it is not fun to go down in that module because it does smell. And so it's always good when you have a chance to take out the trash. And again, it burns up and incinerates in the atmosphere. And so if you're out one day enjoying the beautiful weather here and dust is coming down, that actually might be the trash from the International Space Station that is burning up on its way in. So let's look at some of the just living up there. So the simple things become a little harder, right? So you want to just get a granola bar, and as soon as you open that container, they all want to start floating out. And that is the reality of life in the microgravity environment. It is very challenging. This is actually some dehydrated food, and you dial in how much water it needs. You then plug in, you hit whether you want hot or cold water, and it starts to fill it up. You then let it sit for 10-15 minutes till it's rehydrated. Get out your scissors, grab your spoon, and bon appetit. We also have normal food, peanut butter. I don't know if parents would call that normal food, but we have peanut butter. These are irradiated foods, so kind of like if anybody's familiar with MREs, the military type food. Those are packets of already cooked food, and all you have to do is heat those up. And in this case, this is the dinner table. So they're sitting around having dinner. So you don't have chairs or anything. Obviously, they've got their feet locked into place down there, and they float around the dinner table. And just like down here on Earth, the dinner table becomes a social gathering. Right now, you only see the 3 astronauts that are down on the U.S. side, but the Russian cosmonauts oftentimes join you for dinner, or we join them down in their segment. So we do share a lot of meals. One of the other things I'll point out that's kind of interesting is, let me see if my pointer's going to work here. Maybe I'm off to the side too much. Yeah, it doesn't seem to want to work now, so let me pull out a different pointer. The traditional pointer. Sorry for the folks that are on the video, you might be hard to see. But this is our dining table. And so if you notice these kind of white strips here, that's actually duct tape. And we flipped it over so the sticky side's out, so that when you have some condiments, like this is probably some type of garlic paste or something like that, and you're not using it, it doesn't float away. Because it is very easy to lose things on board the station when they can float away. And so on the dinner table, you've got all this tape, and you've got Velcro and things of that nature to help hold things in place. Exercise, very important for us. That's one of the main reasons, or main ways. That's not how we exercise, but that's one of the main ways we counteract that bone loss and muscle atrophy that I mentioned earlier. So we have a treadmill, we have a weightlifting device, and you'll notice the whole weightless, as we're lifting weights, the whole thing is moving, and that's because it has a vibration isolation system on it, so we don't want to impart loads on the station itself, because you can actually move the station around just by lifting weights up there. The treadmill that you saw, if you noticed, I think actually we're going to see this is the exercise bike. No seat, no handlebars. You don't need them, but it's a pretty good workout while you're on board. And then the treadmill, you can see you got a harness, and these bungee cords are holding you down. And so depending on the number, you got different links, chains that you can put on that. I don't run that fast. If I ran that fast, I'd have been in the NFL. But you can change the number of links you use, and based on that, you can increase the load that you're being held down onto that treadmill. And so that exercise is extremely important for us, because that is the main way we counteract that bone loss and the muscle atrophy. So we actually schedule 2 hours a day to exercise. And when you think about what it takes to get an astronaut on board the International Space Station, it is expensive, and to the tune of $70 million a seat. And so you want to utilize every minute you can of that person's time on board, and yet we have to take 2 hours out of their day and make sure they have time to exercise. And the reason for that is because when you come back to Earth, you need to be able to still function. And if you didn't, it would be very, very challenging when you got back on Earth.
The men lacrosse and hockey.
I like to show this one. Actually,
yep,
I'm going to kind of set this one up. I'm going to go back here, and then we'll come back to it. Family again. Here's that theme that I like to talk about. NASA does a great job of helping you stay in touch with your families while you're on board the International Space Station. We have what's called an IP phone, which allows you to call home, call actually anybody. Right now I could get a call, you could get a call from one of the astronauts on board the space station. And we also have the opportunity to do a video conference once a week with your families. And so that video conference, in our case, they usually issue the spouse like an iPad or a tablet that has the software on it. And so for my wife, that actually allowed her to be mobile, and I'll get to why that is, because my two sons were playing on 5 different sports teams while we were there, and so she was constantly on the go. In fact, so there were times I actually called my wife every day when I was on board station, and with the kids on all the sports teams and piano and the religious education, and she was working and going to school to get her master's in nursing. There were several times when I would call her and say, "Hey, what's going on?" And she'd be like, "I don't got time, call me later," and she would hang up on you. So kind of an interesting moment when you realize that everything is not centered around the space station and the work you're doing up there, that life is still continuing down on Earth. But that video conference and one of the things that made it so special was because she was mobile.
Sure can. Where's Lucas playing? No, I can't tell.
Weekends, because my sons are playing hockey. And so
fortunately, we have a video link, so I've been able to keep track of their games and be there in spirit, if not in person.
Video conference, and I got to watch them play hockey live from the International Space Station.
That's all right. Keep fighting back.
At the rink.
It was really fun because my son got to take a penalty shot and actually scored, so that was fun for Mike to see. It was really exciting for him.
And following the game with the iPad and I'm watching as it takes place. Extremely, extremely important.
He feels a little bit more connected to the kids because I know it's hard. I know he misses that stuff a lot.
But it was, and why do I think that is so important? It allows you to stay in touch with life down on Earth. It allows you to stay in touch with your families. And when you stay in touch with your families and you still feel like you're a part of their lives, even if it's only for 30 minutes on Sunday, it makes you that much more effective during the rest of the week when you're having to work, because you know everything is okay. And so that's something that I think NASA does extremely well, is emphasizing the families and making sure you're still allowed or have the opportunity to stay in touch with them. And so there's events like this, birthdays. You get to have video conferences with them on your birthday or on birthdays. I was actually on board for Christmas and New Year's, and so you get to, in fact, Julie, believe it or not, hosted a New Year's party that probably had 150 people there. And we were able to call down video conference in during the New Year's party. So it was actually 6 in the morning on board station when it was turning midnight up there, but it was still it was pretty neat to be able to be a part of that experience. So what else do we do with our free time when we're up there? We do a lot of looking out the window, and so I think, you guys have the opportunity down here to see the southern lights. We get to see those as well. And when you see them from our vantage point, it is pretty breathtaking, as you can imagine. We also end up taking a lot of just photographs. You'll take photographs of your hometown as you're flying over it. You'll take photographs, like I tried to get a photograph of every football stadium I'd played in college. But then you also just take photographs of amazing scenery like this. This is actually sand dunes and in the desert, and when you get to see how the wind creates these amazing geometric formations while you're up there, or from that vantage point, it really takes you away. Because normally I wouldn't call myself a desert guy, right? I wouldn't call that's somewhere I really want to go visit. But when you see it from here, it gives you an appreciation for it that you didn't have previously. And including scenes like this, where to me, again, it just looks like a painting. It's incredible, the views that you see, and just time and time again, every time you look out the window, you're seeing something like this. Another one that things have a little bit different appearance. This is actually the Grand Canyon in the United States. And what's kind of interesting about this is it probably looks like to you it's coming out of the page, at least it does for me. And so you get these, when you have these different sun angles and all of that, it can create shadows in a way that makes things appear differently than what they really are. And so the Grand Canyon was amazing. I like to show this next picture, and the reason I like to show it is because I think this is I thought this was a great picture when I took it. And the reason is, here's this typhoon, so this was in the Pacific, and I'd lined up this robotic arm with it where it was kind of pointing towards the eye and all of that, and boy, this is a fantastic picture. And then you have to kind of remind yourself that there are millions and millions and millions of people on Earth that are in harm's way, in danger because of this hurricane or this typhoon. And so it's very easy in space to lose perspective and to lose touch a little bit with life down on Earth. And so I like this picture because it reminds me of that fact, that it's not just what's happening on board that International Space Station, but there's a much bigger picture going on. This is by far my favorite picture on board the International that I took while I was on board. The colors just fascinate me. It looks like a painting. And actually what you are looking at is this is an area of deep water in the Caribbean. And then that was a close-up of this portion, and that's a shallower water, and you're actually looking down through the water at the sand formations underneath the water. And so the fact that you can see that and get that kind of detail from the International Space Station is truly, truly incredible. So that is the story of one of many astronauts. That's not necessarily the day in the life, that's 166 days in the life, or probably more appropriately 2 years plus 166 days, because once you get assigned to a mission, it's about a 2-year training process, and you got to see some of the things that occurred during that 2 years leading up to the launch, and then 166 days. And quite frankly, I should say 2 years, 166 days plus 6 months, because once you get back to Earth, you go through a 6-month post-flight. And so initially you're going through 2 months of rehabilitation and a lot of medical experiments. So they want to get everything they can out of you before you readapt to the 1G environment. And so consequently, that means you are having poked and prodded and x-rays and MRIs, you name it, they're doing it to you in that initial 2 months that you're back. And then the next 4 months or so, you go on post-flight PRs, so public relation events, and you go out and you share the story. And it's really important. It's one of the jobs that we do as astronauts is public outreach and let people know what is happening in the human spaceflight program. And it's a fun part of the job because it's a story that just practically tells itself. All you got to do is show some videos and just narrate it. But it is a neat job, and it is a long process. When an astronaut goes into space, it is a 3-4 year process to make all of that happen. But again, mine is just one of many. What I'd like to do now is take any questions that you may have, and then I will, once we've had a few questions and I get the nod from Ian and the folks here that we need to move along, I will end with one more slide and kind of some last thoughts on what we're doing with the human spaceflight program. And then after that, we'll maybe have some opportunity for some autographs and things of that nature. So let us open it up to questions. I see one. Let's see. Grace, you're going to take the mic around? Okay. I leave it up to you then to pick whoever's.
Thank you. Can you hear me, Michael?
I can.
Okay. Thank you very much for entertaining and very interesting speak. I'm interested if you can just share with us, I read that you spent 12 hours and 58 minutes on EVAs.
Yeah.
Can you just tell us a little bit, especially the one which was on Christmas Eve? Thank you.
All right, so I'd be happy to share that. What I'm actually going to do then is I've got some some other slides here, so bear with me while I'm, it's all, I have got more videos and more slides and pictures that I would love to be able to share, but these guys always limit me in how long they let me talk, so I have to pick and choose, and sometimes that's hard to do. So back when we went to the International Space Station, launched in September of 2013, we did not have any planned spacewalks. And the reason we didn't have any planned spacewalks was because earlier, I think it was either June or July, before we got there, 2 astronauts were out on a spacewalk, and one of them, his helmet started filling up with water. He had a failure with the suit, and so they had to abort the spacewalk, the EVA, and get inside. And while I'm telling that story, I'm also going to, again, this common theme, the family. One of the things that when you go out on a spacewalk, they will bring your families into mission control, and you get to watch, the family gets to watch the spacewalks if they so desire. So this guy that had his helmet starting to fill up with water, his wife was watching all of that happen real time. And we lost comm with him because his headset and all of that started filling up with water, and so a very stressful time for her. But what that meant in terms of the suits was that once that failure happened, they were no-go. We couldn't go out on spacewalks until we figured out what had happened. And so, again, when I went up there, we didn't have a planned spacewalk because that investigation was ongoing. Turns out when I first got up there that there was a piece to this, a little fan pump that had gotten clogged up and failed. Now, these suits weren't meant to be maintained on orbit. They were designed and built in the era of the space shuttle where you took the suits up with you on the shuttle, you did your spacewalks, you then brought them back down, and you did any maintenance you needed to on the ground. Well, since the shuttle retired, we leave the suits up there. And that meant, in this case, we had to do this maintenance on this particular part that wasn't planned to be done up there when I first got on board. And so now we were going through this process of clearing the suits for use. And in the meantime, December 11th, we had a failure. Remember I pointed those big radiators? We had a failure with one of the pump modules that kept the cooling, the ammonia, going through those big radiators. And what that meant then, we had to actually shut down about half of the space station because we couldn't get rid of the heat that we were generating. We had all kinds of thermal limits that we were busting if we didn't start shutting things down. So now the team on the ground is weighing the risk. Do we take astronauts out the door? Do we risk losing pieces and parts of the space station because of thermal limitations? And because the suits, the repairs had been made, and it was a matter of just finishing up a lot of the paperwork and things of that nature, they went ahead and decided they'd send us out the door for the spacewalks. And that was an interesting day when they called us up and said, hey, we're going to send you out on a spacewalk, and by the way, that suit you repaired, you're wearing it. But what ended up happening is we had 2 spacewalks, December 21st, and then the second one was December 24th, Christmas Eve, 2013. We go out the door for the final installation of the pump module. And so this is the robotic arm. That's me right there, and that's the pump module that about the size of a refrigerator, weighs 800 pounds, and that's what we are replacing. So this arm had been over on this section, and that's where this spare was located. So we've already removed the failed unit. That was on the first EVA, the first spacewalk. And now we're going to move that into place and install it in reconnect all of the ammonia lines and to get it back up and going. The reason what I'm going to show you next is the moment, that sheer terror that I had that occurred just for a few seconds while I was outside. When this arm, it's moving, and when it comes to a stop, it's a little flexible, so you'll have some oscillations. And I'm holding on this 800-pound pump module. It's oscillating, and when it stopped, I had for about 2 or 3 seconds this feeling as if I was coming off of the arm and floating away into space with the pump module. Now, when you're going to watch the movement of the arm and you're going to see it oscillate, and you're probably going to have to really squint because it doesn't look that bad. But believe me, when I was on the end of that arm and going through that,
This is the most scary thing I've ever done.
Terrifying moment. So
because when you're outside, you feel vulnerable.
And that little oscillation right there.
Got to take a few selfies.
I felt like I was zooming off into space and was going to be the next satellite orbiting the Earth. But the spacewalks are something very challenging. I know you're getting a very long answer, but it's a good excuse to show the video and tell the story. But you do get an opportunity to take a few photos as well, look down at the Earth from that vantage point, and there's nothing like going out on a spacewalk. Every astronaut, I think, that's kind of a dream job to get to do, and so I certainly feel lucky that I had an opportunity to do that, even though we didn't have one planned. So very long answer for your very simple question.
What does a black hole look like?
What does a black hole look like? Black. So fortunately, we don't have any black holes near us, and so on board the International Space Station, we don't really look for those black holes. We actually have other satellites and telescopes and things of that nature that are out looking for the black holes, and there are a lot of really smart scientists, like the director of this museum, that can tell you all about black holes much better than I can. So fortunately, we didn't see any, but they are definitely out there, but they're a long way away, which is a good thing. All right, where are we going next, Rachel? Yeah, that was a shorter question. I caught you by surprise, or a shorter answer. Caught you by surprise.
Hi there. Oh, hello. Do you think you're going to get back onto the space station anytime soon, or?
Do I think I'm going to go back up to the space station anytime soon? You saw that poster with all of the astronauts, the NASA astronauts, and we are only currently launching about 4 astronauts a year. And so there's about, all of the faces that were on there, some of them have left the office, but there's about 50 active astronauts. And so that means you can very quickly do the math. It can take a while before you get another flight. So I've been back on Earth now for 4 years. It's not uncommon to wait 5, 6, or maybe more years in between flights. In fact, one of the people that is getting ready to launch to the space station in June, Serena Anand, was one of my classmates, and that's her first flight. So sometimes it can take 8, 9, 10 years to get up there for your first flight. So one of the things that's happening right now is we are building 2 new vehicles. SpaceX and Boeing are building 2 new vehicles that are going to take us to the International Space Station. And so I am heavily involved in those programs, and that will allow us to increase the number of launches that we're doing, or increase the number of astronauts that we potentially can have on board. And there is a chance that I could be on that, but I feel very lucky to have gotten one mission, but it'd certainly be fun to do another one. All right, yes?
What's it like adapting to Earth's gravity again?
What's it like adapting to Earth's gravity again? It is hard. You get used to floating, and that's quite an experience. Actually, I'll answer in terms of the transitions. All the transitions are difficult. So going uphill is also difficult. When you go from Earth's gravity to 0G, or microgravity, that is an uncomfortable transition as well. So when I mentioned 9 minutes, a little less than 9 minutes to get up into space. So when that third stage kicked off, and you kind of get thrown forward in your seat, and from that moment on, I felt like I was falling. So if we were to climb up on top of this building and jump off, and kind of when you jump off of something high, that rushing sensation that you get, I had that rushing sensation, that falling sensation, and it lasted about 24 hours. So a bit strange, a bit weird feeling, but also not that bad. Now coming back to Earth, also had problems. You've heard about sea legs. Well, you definitely get space legs. And so your inner ear, which helps you with your balance and all of that, it gets messed up when you're not down in 1G environment like we are right now. And so things like pitching motion was very provocative for me. So just a small motion like you just saw me do, just like that, and I would feel like I was going to fall over on my face, because up in space, if I had done that small little motion, I'd have done a flip. And so that's pretty strange to be back in an environment where that's not what happens. The other thing that, real quick with that, is weight. So you forget how much things weigh. Your mind forgets how much things weigh. So you saw that exercise that we do. to stay strong. So when you land, you're just as strong as you were before you left. And yet, when I landed, I'm sitting on my back, and there's a window off to the side, and I'm trying just to lift my head up to look out the window to see if the search and rescue guys were coming, and I could barely lift my head up. My head, my neck is shaking as I'm trying to pick my head up, and it's not because I was any less strong. I was weaker. It was simply because I didn't know how much force I needed to put into my muscles to make that happen. And that made it feel pretty weird. Yes?
When do you think going to space will be able to be commercialized so the general public can go to space?
I'm sorry, so if the commercial, say it one more time for me?
When do you think it will be able for the general public to be
Oh,
able
okay,
to go to space?
yeah. When do I think, the general public, commercialization of space, when do I think all of that can happen and it's easier for more people to have an opportunity to go to space? Not soon enough is one answer with it. But the fact that we are building multiple vehicles, commercial vehicles, and so that means they're not necessarily directly under the control of NASA, that is going to start paving the way for that to happen. It's still very expensive, though. So we are just in the early stages of that commercialization. But one of the things that we are that NASA's goal is with this commercialization, having these companies build these spacecraft, they're going to take us to the International Space Station, is basically to turn over low Earth orbit to commercial companies. And so they can start taking over the International Space Station. They can start doing the science, sending people up there, and NASA is going to then focus on going back to the moon and going on to Mars. And so when that actually happens, I think you will see opportunities for not just the 15 countries that make up the International Space Station, but other countries. New Zealand, for instance, could work with these companies and decide we're going to send an astronaut up for 2 months to do experiments. And boy, wouldn't that be fantastic, right? That would be a wonderful thing to see happen. So it's not just one more. Oh no, give me a few more than that, Ian, come on.
You said that the Russian module was 20 years old.
Yeah.
How long does the International Space Station actually last for? And when it kind of gets too old, what happens and what replaces it?
Yeah. All very good questions. So right now, the International Space Station has political agreements to continue operating it out to 2024. And so that means all of the partner countries that I've talked about have agreed to continue paying to maintain and operate the station. You saw some of the maintenance that we had to do on that pump module to replace it. And so we tried to predict the things that might fail and how much supplies we needed to have on board when we retired the shuttle, because things like that pump module can only come up on the shuttle. And so we are, the right failure at the wrong time could shut down a lot of the capabilities with the space station. But as of right now, we think we can continue maintaining it at least until 2024, and then that's where we're starting to look at can we maybe turn over a little bit to commercialization and things of that nature. So what comes next? Yeah, great question there too. We don't have a replacement for the space station. All right, so when the space station goes away, the plan there is when it is time to deorbit it, it is going to be a controlled burn that's going to cause it to come down into the atmosphere at a certain location and in a certain orientation to make sure that it doesn't land on any population centers down here on Earth. So that is all part of the plan. And again, the plan right now is for us to go back to the moon and go on to Mars. And so the next space station that you might see, the current thinking is that's going to be around the moon. And so we're going to send astronauts to a station out there, and from there you'll go down to the moon or potentially go on to Mars. So that's kind of the next goal. Where's our next question? I think, so we've got maybe till 15 after. Is that okay for questions? Is that going to be okay? All right, so we've got about 15 more minutes for questions, so hopefully we can get through as many as you can. If you can't tell, I like to talk, and I'll go long on my questions. So are my answers.
How do you take a shower?
How do you take a shower in space? Great question. You don't. You don't, yeah. So you noticed how the water behaved in space, right? And so the problem is in space, you don't, you can't get water to just fall down around you, and so you end up just basically, taking a sponge bath all the time. Let me see if I have a good picture. No, I don't have it in here. I actually have a great picture, a great video, but I don't have it on this particular slide presentation of Karen Nyberg, who was the woman astronaut you saw on board with me, washing her hair. And you might wonder how she washes her hair on board the International Space Station. Well, what you end up doing is you just get it wet. So you just squirt a little bit of water on it, wash it around, and then we have, believe it or not, a no-rinse shampoo. And so you take that no-rinse shampoo, you rub it around your head, and then you take a towel and dry it off, and voila, your hair is washed. So it's hygiene up there is challenging. Since we're on that topic, things like brushing your teeth, right? You tend to use a lot less toothpaste than what we do down here, and you just put a little drop of water on your toothbrush, because what ends up happening is you don't have a sink to spit it in, right? So you got to either swallow the suds and all of that, or you spit it out in a towel. And so you kind of want to minimize how much of that you have to do one way or the other. For the men in here, shaving, you can have an electric razor. I don't like the electric razor, so I end up using just the disposable blade type thing, and you use one a day up there because you don't have a way to rinse out the blade. And so just from one shaving, it gets clogged up, and so if you think about it, then 166 days, I needed 166 razors while I was up there. So things like that become challenging, and then the last one that I'll mention then, of course, is the human waste that I talked about. So from a hygiene standpoint there, we collect our urine and we recycle it, and that becomes our drinking water. So that is something that takes a little bit of getting used to. All right, where's our next? All the way in the back.
Hi. I'm just wondering, you said the service module comes up every 1.5 to 3 months, bringing you supplies and things like that. So what happens if there was an issue and they couldn't dock? Do you have another couple of months' supply of food up there,
yeah,
or can they get another module up there within like a 2-week turnaround sort of thing?
That's a great question, and we've had those scenarios happen to us. So the question basically is if we get a supply vehicle every month or every month and a half or so, and it is a very delicate balance of having enough food and supplies on board the International Space Station. And so we actually try and maintain about 6 months of food on board at any one time, so that if you do have the situation where you lose a vehicle, you can get by until you get a new one up there. And what happened? So we actually had a situation probably about 2.5, 3 years ago, where we lost 3 vehicles in the span of like 9 months, and that really put us in a bind up there. And so what ends up happening is you start stretching things. So that means like your clothes, all of a sudden you don't get to change your underwear as often as you did before, and so that can make things a little bit challenging. And so that's something that we're always very concerned about. And when something like that happens, there's an immediate you remanifest what you've got on the next vehicle coming up, because now all of a sudden the things to keep the astronauts alive become more important. And in fact, if it's bad enough, and when we had that situation losing 3 vehicles, we actually considered reducing the number of astronauts on board the station just because we didn't necessarily have enough supplies to keep them going up there. So it is a big deal for us. All right, we're back in the back there as well.
Yeah, so you said that you guys are thinking of returning to the moon and doing science there. What was the reason for the cancellation of the original Apollo mission?
Yeah, why did we cancel back in 1969? Neil Armstrong and Buzz land on the moon, and then 72 you had Harrison Smith, and who was with Harrison Smith? Who was it? Cernan, yeah, Gene Cernan, thank you. So they were the last 2 people to walk on the moon. Why did we cancel it? It was expensive. It's a very expensive program, and we were looking at what the next thing was, and that was the shuttle. and that was the Skylab at that time as well. And so now there was a push for having these space stations orbiting Earth. And so that's why it got canned. I mean, unfortunately, the space program for all the countries is we are a political football a little bit sometimes as well. And so when you have new administrations come in, they change their objectives for NASA and their goals, and sometimes that has impacts on what we're doing and whether programs like going to the moon or things of that nature are going to continue or not. And so I don't have certainly a good reason. I was actually born in 1968, so I was a little young when they decided to cancel the Apollo program. But it's unfortunate. But what it does highlight is just how hard it is to go to the moon. And if it was simple, we would have gone back already. And it's very challenging. And so we've got work to do to get there again. Yeah.
Has anyone ever been sick?
Has anyone ever been sick in space? Yes, people have gotten sick in space, but one of the things we do to try and minimize that is we go into quarantine before we launch. So about two weeks out from launch, you are in what we call quarantine, which means we limit the number of people that you are exposed to. And so we're still going through training and all of that all the way up till launch, but any of the people that are training you, they have to be able to prove that they're not sick and they don't have any infectious sicknesses, a cold or anything of that nature that they might pass along to you. So if I was close to launch, I couldn't come and do a talk like this because there's just more risk and potential. And the reason for that is once you get on board the space station, if you are sick or you do get sick, everybody is going to get sick because we recirculate. The air is constantly recirculating, and those germs are going to get passed around to everybody. So on board the space station, we actually have a full medical kit with all kinds of medications. We have a defibrillator on board. We have ways to treat serious emergencies on board. When you are assigned to a mission, you actually get assigned a flight doc that's responsible for keeping you healthy. And when you're actually on board, you meet with that flight doc via video conference once a week. And you also, every 2 weeks, you meet with a psychologist and a psychiatrist via video conference because they want to make sure you're also mentally staying healthy while you're up there, because clearly that would be a bad thing as well. So we take our health and our fitness very seriously while we're on board the station. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for coming to Dunedin, first of all.
Yeah, you bet.
Okay, so there's lots to overcome, clearly, in becoming an astronaut, and that might come in the way of study or training and things like that. So I'd like to know and as you said, you spent like 4 times before you became an astronaut in trialing. What differentiates you from your classmates who are also vying for the same position, but also like the common man?
Nothing is the simple answer to that. So I had the privilege of being on the board, the selection board, for our last class that we just selected last year. So they started in August of 2017. We had over 18,000 applicants, and we selected 12. We took those 18,000 applicants, and we just reviewed them, and there was, we were able to whittle them down to, I'll say, 10,000. Just based on the minimum qualifications and things of that nature. And then from that 10,000, I mentioned we have 50 active astronauts. At least one astronaut looked at every one of those applications. So you can imagine how long you have to actually look at an application. It's not a lot. So you do the best you can, and you get it down to, say, around 400 or so. And then at that point, we ask for references. And then we bring, out of those 400, you select 120. And you bring them in for an interview. And so they spend 3 days at Johnson Space Center, and so during that time they actually will bring them in for an interview. There's about 10 astronauts that are sitting around a table, and that person is sitting there, and they have to answer all kinds of questions. So you can imagine that's a fairly stressful environment for them. But from there we get it down to 40, and then we bring those 40 back for another week of interviews and other tests. and from that we choose who gets to come and be an astronaut. So where I'm going with that, again, kind of a long-winded answer, is by the time we get down to that 120, they're all extremely qualified. Every one of them would make an absolute fantastic astronaut, but you have to choose, right? Because there's not enough slots for everybody. And so for somebody that's interested in being an astronaut, we always tell them that you need to get involved in the STEM, so science, technology, engineering, math. You need to have that kind of a background. But then most importantly as well is you need to find something that you love, something that you're very passionate about, and you have to go out and pour your heart and soul into that. And then if you want to be an astronaut, for example, you just never give up. All right. I mean, I've got 3 rejection letters from NASA, and I was, like I said, I was kind of determined that I was going to keep applying until they told me no. And so it is not a perfect system. All right. You are going to miss great people, but you end up with great people as well that can do the job. So it's I don't know. It's not a perfect answer to your question. It's certainly a very difficult job to do as well. Where else are we on? Okay, back here.
Hi there. I was just wondering what you thought was a realistic time frame for like a mission to Mars.
Yeah.
And do you think it would be similar to like the International Space Station, or would it be like a NASA only type mission?
Yeah. So the timeline right now, we're working towards the 2030s, and I would say it's probably going to end up being the latter part of the 2030s rather than the early parts of it. And so that's certainly the goal. Now, is it going to be like the space station? I believe so. I certainly think it's going to be an international effort. It's just too big for any one nation to really handle all of that and build all of the different components. And one of the things that we've got to figure out, though, is right now when we're in low Earth orbit on the International Space Station, we are very dependent on the teams on the ground for our day-to-day operations. When you're going to Mars, that team is not going to have the instantaneous access to data and all of that from your spaceship as you're going there. And so we have to also not only develop the vehicles and the rockets that are going to take there, but we also have to a little bit redevelop how we operate, because there's going to be challenges associated with the comm delays and things of that nature once you start getting out to those kind of distances. And what I mean, so right now we're 400 kilometers up on the International Space Station. When we go to the moon, that's 400,000 kilometers away. And so that takes us 3 to 6, instead of 6 hours, it takes 3 days to get there. And when we go to Mars, we're talking 35 million miles. It's going to take us 6 to 9 months. And so it's not only going to take the development of new systems, but it's going to take development of new ways to operate as well. But that's the timeline that we're shooting for. Yeah.
Are there any other space stations apart from the International Space Station?
Are there any other space stations other than the ISS? So the Chinese had a space station, which I think just recently re-entered Earth's atmosphere. So currently, the 15 countries that make up the International Space Stations are the only ones that have an operating space station up there. All right, so one last question. I apologize. We've got to we're going to have to wrap this portion of it up. Yes, sir.
What is the scariest thing that happened to you as an astronaut?
What is the scariest thing that happened to me as an astronaut? Oftentimes I'll get asked about when you're sitting on the rocket with 600,000 pounds of rocket fuel underneath you getting ready to light or explode. But I wouldn't put that as the most scariest thing, because that actually, when that rocket lights, for many of us, it's a bit of a sense of relief, because as I mentioned, it's a 2-year training program to get to that point. And during that 2 years, you're always worried that you could get sick, you could get injured, or they could just decide that they want to replace you. And so when that rocket lights, you're like, okay, I'm going. They can't take this one away. This is my mission. So there's a little bit of definitely a little bit of relief that happens when the rocket actually lights. And so the scariest moment, I actually have to go back to that spacewalk, as I mentioned, the sitting on that robotic arm that literally is hanging down below the space station. So there is nothing between me and the Earth going by below, and having that sensation of coming off of the robotic arm and floating away with my very own 800-pound pump module. That was certainly probably the most terrifying moment that I had while I was in space. So what I want to end you with, we talked about the day in the life of an astronaut. We talked about how there are 50, 100 stories of astronauts that are just as interesting, just as intriguing. But the reality is that the astronauts are just a small, very small fraction of the human spaceflight program. Nothing that we do in space doesn't happen without the people that you see behind me in mission control, and not just mission control, but the training teams and the support teams. And there are 10,000 people at Johnson Space Center that are dedicated to human spaceflight. There are 50 astronauts, right? So this is the most important part of the team, not the person wearing the blue suit. And so hopefully that's something that you can take away with you. So with that, Ian, thank you very much for listening to my stories. And I think what we're going to do now is maybe sign a few photographs and things of that nature. And while we do that, I'll put on some video, if you're waiting, that's just of some astronauts being silly on board the station, floating around and all of that. And hopefully that'll entertain you a little bit while you might be waiting. So thank you very much. All right.